their initial usage and the gradual escalation in frequency is perfectly tied to retaliation for US actions. So what we see is the development of these tools is all about gaining leverage in interactions primarily, but not exclusively, with the United States. But beginning in 2025, we began to see indications that they may have broader goals in mind.
My name is Ka Zeng, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm delighted and honored to be joined today by two distinguished guests, Evan Medeiros and Andrew Polk, to discuss their new report, China's New Economic Weapons. Briefly, as our full bios can be found on the National Committee's website. Evan Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies in the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the Klein Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies. He's also an NCUSAR board director. Andrew Polk is a co-founder and the head of economic research at Trivium China, which is a strategic advisory firm. Evan, Andrew, and I all have the distinction of being NCUSAR Public Intellectuals program, or the P program. So let's jump right in. We're here to discuss your recent report, China's New Economic Weapons, in which you argue that China is increasingly utilizing a set of regulatory and legal tools as instruments of economic coercion to advance its political goals. You open the report by noting that China's economic behavior has entered a new phase. What motivated you to write this report, and what makes this moment different?
I think what motivated us to write the report was we found that China was moving from the traditional tools of economic coercion, which we talk about at the beginning of the paper. It would stop buying goods from other countries, or it would suspend tourism, it would use non-tariff barriers, sort of the traditional tools of economic competition and economic coercion. And there's a lot of very, very good literature on this. For anybody interested, my colleague at Georgetown, Victor Cha, has a wonderful article in International Security in which he details in an appendix all the instances of economic coercion. But again, those tools of coercion are well known. They've existed for about a decade. The reason I was interested in writing this paper was the fact that the tools of economic coercion were shifting and changing. The Chinese were developing a different set of tools. Largely, we believe, because they came to recognize that the traditional tools of coercion, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, etc., actually put China in an asymmetric disadvantage. And it hurt Chinese businesses, right? So they were looking for different tools. And, in many ways, they looked at what the Americans were doing and said, hey, that's not a bad idea. And so, beginning as early as 2018, they came up with something that they called the Unreliable Entities List, right? Which bears striking resemblance to the American Entity List. They saw how we were using export controls, right? We have all sorts of lists that we put companies on, not just the entities list, other lists. There are all sorts of controls we put on the exports of semiconductors, for example. And so the Chinese started to develop this alternate toolkit, in many ways mirroring the American toolkit, but not always mirroring the American toolkit, right? Some of the most potent tools that they've been using are legal and regulatory tools. And Andrew can talk about how they've used their cybersecurity regulations, how they use their antitrust authorities in ways that the Americans haven't, all for the purposes of generating leverage in negotiations with the Americans and increasingly other countries. So what we saw was a shift in Chinese behavior, a shift that we thought was important, a shift that had not yet been documented, but also a shift that we saw while the tools were initially had been developed for the purposes of competition with the United States, we saw instances, very much leading indicators, where we thought they were going to start using these tools not just to compete with the Americans, but increasingly to generate market share for themselves globally. So, in other words, to put their companies at a globally superior position. Andrew can articulate this better than I can. But we saw this as a very early and important trend that wasn't just related to U.S.-China bargaining, but perhaps to Xi Jinping's broader technology goals. Andrew, did I cover it there?
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. I would say, the moment that we chose in particular was to write, or the choosing this moment to write this paper largely came about because Evan and I were on a trip together and talking about some of these issues, and it was pretty clear that China was building up these capabilities, and in the latter half of 2024 had really started to accelerate their use. And so at Trivium had been tracking these kind of the development of these tools for a while, and seeing that the Chinese leadership was starting to feel that they were ready for prime time, starting to feel that they're ready to be used in the real world to affect various outcomes. And so we started writing the paper, and that only became more and more true as we started to polish off the paper in the first part of 2025 when the Chinese started using their own export controls, their entity lists, their anti-monopoly investigations even more aggressively in the back and forth between the US and China. So it was kind of proving our thesis in real time. And then since we published the paper, I would say it's now quite clear, I think, to most people out there that, China's using these various non-tariff, tools, these new economic weapons to the greatest extent possible in the back and forth with the US and China currently. And so we saw this trend. We struck while we thought the iron was hot, and just so happened that the iron became even hotter just after we published the paper.
Yeah, it's interesting because Andrew and I were both on a trip together to Australia as guests of the Australian Foreign Ministry. So I think we should, Andrew, we should probably th thank the Australian DFAT for bringing us together.
That's right.
And I think in our jet lag hazed, we were both talking about this trend, and folks will recall that in this was the last few months of the Biden administration, and the Biden administration had adopted a variety of controls on exports and technology sharing with China, even in December. And what we saw was actually probably the greatest number of American companies added to the unreliable entities list was in late December, early January, the final days of the Biden administration, which really told Andrew and I that we were really onto something. That, when we started our conversation about this article, which, when were we there? October, November of 24, Andrew?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. A couple weeks before the election, we both noticed, we commented on these trends, but how the Chinese still seemed very careful about how they were using these new tools. It was limited, it was episodic, you know, and it was really in sort of December, January that it was clear that the Chinese had become very confident about using these tools, and you began to see them use them in spades. Now, of course, all of this was before they really weaponized rare earth elements, which I think, modestly, I can say that Andrew and I basically predicted in the article that the Chinese were absolutely moving in this direction. Um, and what's interesting is I think we both believe that it was really the Americans that pushed them in this direction. The Chinese were very reluctant. I mean, Andrew, take us back to the very first time the Chinese just started talking about monkeying around with rare earths. I mean, it goes back to at least 2010, isn't that right?
Yeah, so they, toyed around with this idea in a dispute with Japan in 2010. It didn't work out that well for them. The Japanese, very quickly diversified away from Chinese rare earths and the Chinese didn't leave the rare earth export controls on that long. But they basically then spent the next 15 years saying, well, if we're ever going to get in this situation again, we want to make sure that when we pull these levers, they matter, right? The worst outcome for the Chinese would be to put somebody on that unreliable entity list or implement export controls, and everyone just shrugs and says, well, it's not that big of a deal. And I think it's pretty clear at this point that it is a big they've successfully made it a big deal and gotten everyone's attention, particularly on the rare earth exports. So they have, I think, been planning for this moment actually for quite a while.
Yeah.
So we documented this shift in China's use of economic strategy of economic coercion. And what do you see as the key drivers behind this change? Was it primarily domestic? Was it primarily motivated by a desire to counterbalance the pressure coming from the United States and other countries? Or was it bureaucratic? What do you see as the most important drivers behind the shift in China's economic strategy? And how do these factors interact?
I mean, it's very clear in the pattern of behavior. So Andrew and I built a data set. We've got this extensive spreadsheet with multiple tabs, looking where we document all the cases of the use of these economic tools. And what's a very, very clear pattern is their initial usage and the gradual escalation in frequency is perfectly tied to retaliation for US actions. So what we see is, in, I would say 22, 21, 22, 23, 24, it's the development of these tools is all about gaining leverage in interactions primarily, but not exclusively, with the United States. But beginning in 2025, we began to see indications that they may have broader goals in mind. In other words, using these tools to gain more, global market share.
And I'd say, in addition, the moment that really kind of concentrated Chinese leaders' minds on this issue was the listing of Huawei in, I believe, 2018, sort of pre-real trade war between the US and China, the initial trade war. And so they recognized the US's ability to, effectively kneecap one of their most important companies with the stroke of a pen, and said to themselves, we have to find a way to fight back against this. And to the extent possible, if we need to kneecap American companies, if these tensions persist, which they, rightfully expected those tensions to persist, and they do to today, they wanted to have leverage, as Evan said, like the US. And then there were other developments that really kind of reinforced that view. One was the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the West's response to that, the sort of across the board sanctions, and by across the board I mean sort of the joint sanctions between the US and Europe, very aggressive towards Russia. And that obviously impacted the economy. You can argue about whether or not they achieved the intended aims, but the point was that the Chinese took notice and it further said, we want to be able to fight back against that. And then I would say the other kind of key moment that we document in the piece is the October 2022 export controls that the US put on semiconductor and semiconductor equipment sales to China. Also, the Chinese, very, watershed moment for the Chinese, saying, they're trying to cut off our ability to, access basic technology that is the building blocks for all these other things we want to do technologically. And so that's when they really started emphasizing their own export control regime. So you can really, those three moments, you can sort of see the Chinese either start a process on one of these tools or accelerate a process on one of these tools. And my view would be they were always kind of basically building up to the very moment we're in, such that if tensions raise between the US and China economically, which they obviously did after the Liberation Day tariffs in April, that China could then say, okay, we now have this robust set of capabilities to hit back. Now, there's a bunch of other things they're worried about, additional sanctions on, secondary sanctions on China and a bunch of other things. So we've just kind of seen the first act here. And the last thing I'll say is that the Chinese also realized, I always say, the Chinese were the most prepared country for the trade war that we're in now, right? A lot of other countries thought Donald Trump might put tariffs on them, but China knew that Donald Trump would put additional tariffs on China. And so they were also, because of the previous trade war, they knew that fighting tit for tat on tariff levels kind of exhausts China's arsenal quite quickly. And so they needed additional leverage points in order to gain some kind of upper hand in the negotiations. And I again would say they seem to have done that fairly successfully with the rare earth exports that are now very concerning to the US and many other countries.
I mean, I completely agree with Andrew. I mean, it's notable to me that when you look at Trump policy, I mean, basically the Trump administration has validated the Chinese view that national security actually is negotiable, right? Americans had consistently said it's non-negotiable, but now it's very negotiable. And as a result, I think there's almost an explicit, not almost, there is an explicit linkage between Chinese access to advanced chips, the H20 in particular from NVIDIA, and American access to rare earths, especially heavy magnets, right? And that's sort of where we are today. And when I talk to Chinese interlocutors, they feel very comfortable. They feel very confident. As one person told me, um, we were sort of reluctant to weaponize rare earths, but you pushed us to do it, and now we're very happy we did because we found this critical source of leverage, and it has succeeded beyond our expectations. And now we've even been able to get access to the H20, right? This advanced chip from NVIDIA. So I think from the Chinese perspective, this shift to, precision guided economic munitions, as Andrew and I call them, it's worked fabulously for them. It's worked so well that you now have the Trump administration, if you believe the Financial Times this morning, the Commerce Department has put a freeze on all new export control restrictions on Chinese technology as the administration enters into the negotiations in Stockholm today and prepares for what's likely to be a state visit by Donald Trump to Beijing either before or after APEC this year. So from the Chinese perspective, they're doing great, and they've accomplished far more than they expected in developing and deploying these new tools.
And I'd just add quickly to the back of that point by Evan that what they've also successfully done is really move the center of gravity on what the negotiations with the US are about. I would argue that the negotiations, tariffs are sort of an afterthought at this point in the negotiations. Yes, the Chinese will want to try to reduce the 20% tariff that the US has put on because of fentanyl precursors and things like that. They certainly want tariffs to come down, but I can pretty much guarantee you the majority of the discussion in Stockholm isn't going to be about tariff rates. It's going to be access to, key technologies and key inputs, rare earths and other critical minerals. So they've kind of also moved the Overton window or whatever you want to call it, the locus of the discussion with the US to these, what we would call sort of a mutually assured decoupling, rather than how much we're going to tax each other's imports.
Yeah, I mean, to Andrew's excellent point, the trade war between the US and China has effectively transitioned, in my mind, to really a supply chain competition or a supply chain war. That's really what it's all about. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese, seeing how the Trump administration reacted with licensing the H20 and now freezing export controls, um, whether or not they start to go after other tech restrictions they don't like. For example, the ban on Chinese EVs coming into the United States. Donald Trump has talked very publicly about wanting to welcome Chinese investment in the United States. Investment by other countries like Japan in particular has always been a big feature of the trade deals, right? It's a reduction, it's a new tariff level, and it's a commitment to investment. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese start to explore with the Trump administration what one or two high profile investments might be able to look like. And so I think that the Stockholm meeting is really interesting to me because it's unlike Geneva and London. Geneva and London were about finding a stable status quo on export controls and supply chains. I think that this London meeting will be about those issues, but really they're going to start to put together a broader omnibus economic package that will have tariffs. But as Andrew pointed out, tariffs are sort of feels like yesterday's news in the US-China relationship. It's now export controls. It may be Chinese investment in the United States. It'll certainly be Chinese purchases, uh, energy, agriculture. A big buy from Boeing is likely as well. So I really think, and maybe some agreement to finalize deals on TikTok and other, the Chinese have a variety of antitrust investigations going on, and maybe those will sort of magically vanish, as they have before, as a way to create a more permissive economic environment. So I very much agree with Andrew that we're really beginning to see the transition to something broader and different than just tariff rates.
That's an interesting observation. And just to piggyback a little bit more on our discussion so far, do you see China's economic coercion effective? And China has resorted to the use of economic coercion in the past, oftentimes with mixed results. So what has China achieved and where has it failed or backfired? And given that often these new economic tools are oftentimes deployed in a precise and targeted manner, in order to minimize the impact of economic coercion on broader US-China strategic and economic relations, how effective do you see these new tools to be in the future going forward?
I would point out, I would think my assessments that they've been pretty effective. I would first point out that these tools, China using these tools against the US is actually quite remarkable in that typically, as Evan noted at the beginning, the kind of typical or the traditional literature around economic coercion, those traditional tools, China very rarely used those tools against the US. It was much more willing to use those tools against smaller economies that were much more reliant on China and where it could throw around its weight, extract some serious pain, and hope that the other country would eventually back down. And it sort of used the success of those measures kind of worked to varying degrees. Sometimes it was very successful, like against Norway, for example, and some smaller economies in Europe, but not particularly successful in getting the Australians to back down, for example, in the wake of calling for a COVID investigation and for reducing Chinese political interference in Australia. But very rarely, even when the US was involved, would China go after the US with tools like this, because the US is such a big economy and they sort of weren't sure whether they were going to get the short end of the stick or not. So, but this time they have very carefully planned to use these tools explicitly against the US. And I would say they've been successful insofar as they have moved that center of gravity around the discussions away from tariffs to these other issues where China has significant amounts of leverage that it can bring to bear. Now, I would also say that they haven't necessarily been successful in that, like, we don't have an outcome yet. We're not sure whether or not, the Chinese are going to extract outcomes that they want from the US. And I would also say in this instance, China very much views kind of everybody to be a loser in this situation. They don't want to be necessarily in a trade war with the US or a supply chain war. We can kind of go back and forth and argue about who started what when. I know there are various viewpoints on that, but just in this moment, China would prefer to have avoided altogether. But if we're going to get here, they've prepared to, use these tools as part of that process. So I would say in some ways they've been successful. So first of all, successful insofar as they, are being deployed with some effect. Secondly, they have moved the center of discussion, but ultimately the success or failure of these tools, we don't really know yet. And I think if they are successful, it only really limits damage to China. It doesn't really potentially gain them all that much. I don't know. Is that, do you agree with that characterization, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's a little too early to tell or to conclude success or failure. What I would say is when it comes to the use of things like the rare earth export controls, which again are relatively new, right? I mean, I believe it was only October of 24, so not even a year ago that they first developed their sort of dual use list. Is that right, Andrew? Did I get the
I think that's right. There's several different lists. One of them was implemented in October 24. A couple
Yeah.
were early 25, but basically the right time frame. Yeah.
So the Chinese have used that tool to create a linkage with access to advanced semiconductors in the US, and then have used that to gain specific access to the H-20. So in that sense, it's been a success. But of course, this is the Trump administration. So the Trump administration has particular features to it that the Chinese have effectively used, these export controls for. So I would say it's easy to, I mean, you can point to that, but I agree with Andrew. Over the long term, if all you're doing is accelerating the diversification, right? So 2 weeks ago, we saw the U.S. Defense Department take a 15% equity stake in Mountain Pass and begin to adopt the kinds of things you would need to build a solid rare earth industry in the United States, guaranteed offtake, price floors, right? The kind of features that are going to be essential to have a viable business entity producing rare earth elements in the US. So if the Chinese, really what they do is they have this tool, they can use it for a few years, and then it goes away, then maybe it's not effective. One interesting dimension of these tools, but Andrew can correct me, I don't believe there's much evidence of the Chinese using export controls, unreliable entities list, cybersecurity regs, or antitrust against other economies, not beyond the United States. Is that right, Andrew? We haven't really, or have we seen it
Correct.
in the context of the EU, Andrew?
Not really. There were some sanctions against the EU around Xinjiang several years ago, but I don't think they added to the unreliable any Chinese or excuse me EU companies to the unreliable entities list.
Yeah.
So they've just recently added some Taiwanese defense contractors, I believe, which were the first
Oh,
non-US
interesting. Yeah.
entities added. But that is a good point. These were sort of tailor-made for the back and forth with the US. And I will just add that you make a great point on, I think another reason China was reluctant to use these tools is that they knew in a way it's sort of you get one shot to do this because they've now woken up the rest of the world to the fact that we are so reliant on Chinese rare earths and other critical minerals. We all knew that, but nobody did anything about it for 15 or 20 years. And now countries are going to start doing something about it. And so they've made their point, but they've also kind of basically shot the starting gun such that the rest of the world's going to try to become much less reliant on China for many of these items. And so, like I said earlier, in a way, they didn't want to be in the situation. They didn't want to have to do this, but they felt like this was the moment, and they certainly have gotten people's attention.
Thank you for that point. We don't have a lot of time left, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on the policy implications of your piece. It seems that China has been pushed to develop and to expand its economic arsenal in response to hardened stance on the part of the United States and its allies. So what kind of policy implications might this have for future U.S. foreign policy, for future U.S. foreign economic policy toward China? And how might the United States and its allies best deal with China's use of economic coercion?
What I would say is, and what we say in the piece, is that the natural policy response is to pursue an approach of diversification and resilience. But of course, that takes a political consensus to do that. And in the case of developing a non-China exposed rare earth element industry, it's been very, very difficult. But I think that the Chinese actions have sort of focused American policymakers in ways that they haven't before. And I mentioned the recent efforts to reinvigorate the Mountain Pass mine in the United States. So I think that one implication is hopefully it will really accelerate. It will accelerate how the United States deals with this particular vulnerability and exposure. But we sort of have to see how it all plays out because we're in a funny period and even though we've been talking very narrowly about, these new economic tools that China has, it sits within a broader context. And we're at a very funny moment in the US-China relationship. Funny in the sense that it's not what I, sort of as a scholar, former policymaker, would have expected. Because the structural features of the relationship are all towards strategic competition, right? We compete in all sorts of areas. And I think Andrew would agree there's largely a bipartisan consensus in America that we are engaged in a long-term competition, and America needs to both invest in itself to run faster, but also adopt measures to slow China down. That's the structural dimension of the relationship. But there's this funny cyclical trend going on where President Trump has basically said, I'm not really that interested in strategic competition. I want to engage Beijing. I want to, I like Xi Jinping. I respect him. I want to go to China. I want to do big deals with him. And it's likely there's going to be some sort of omnibus economic package that I talked about earlier that's going to be released. It's possible that political military issues could come into those talks at some point. I would note that it was in the press just today that the Trump administration has canceled or postponed a transit of Taiwan President Lai Ching-te through the United States, and as a result, Lai has canceled his travels abroad because he can't transit through the United States. So we don't know, does Taiwan become part of this package? So we're in this funny instance where the cyclical trends are all towards engaging China, doing deals with China, accommodating China, freezing export controls on China, as the Financial Times reported this morning. And President Trump basically has nobody to his right, nobody in the Republican Party that is criticizing him. And unlike the first Trump administration, the cabinet dynamics are such that there's not a group of hardliners. There's no Jim Mattis or Pompeo or Bolton or Matt Pottinger who are sort of nipping at the heels of Trump, looking for opportunities to do things like put ZTE or Huawei on the entities list. You don't have any of those dynamics. So in many ways, Trump is running his own China policy, and it's all about engagement driven by economic engagement. So we're in a funny space. And the question is, how much is he going to achieve? Will that fundamentally change the character of the relationship? And most importantly, is Trump's engagement intensive approach, is it politically sustainable? Andrew?
Yeah, that's all great points. I would just add, I think the policy implication for me is that it's time to get down to brass tacks in terms of determining what vulnerabilities reliance on China has exposed and which vulnerabilities we truly want to address. So my view would be we can't fully decouple with China and so commercially. And so, how much is enough? The reason I bring that up is, China has actually been quite careful with the rare earths, or they tried to be, to specifically put export controls on the types of rare earths that are most used in defense and less, important to commerce and industry, things like cell phones and things like that. The problem was a lot of these are used in both, and so there were spillover effects, particularly in the auto sector. But the way China was trying to get our attention was by saying, we're going to restrict the things that you need to continue, building your defense capabilities. And so I think it totally makes sense for policymakers to look and say, how many rare earths exactly do we need every year to build, F-18 fighters and radar systems and things like that, and say we are going to, use the power of the federal government to procure those in any way possible in a way that does not rely on China. Now, so that I think is an obvious one. Then you start to think about, further down the line on the commercial side, how much does it matter if our companies buy graphite and germanium from China to go into vehicles and to go into cell phones? Probably less so, although they could still weaponize that. And I think that's what, people are worried about. But if we can't take that vulnerability down to zero, how much is enough? And those are the conversations that need to start being had, to really effectuate a sustainable, not decoupling, but what do we call it now?
De-risking.
Yeah, de-risking from China. So that to me is the main policy implications. Everyone can say, "Oh, we need to rely on China less," but specifically, how much is it okay to rely on China commercially or not? And where do we draw those, bright red lines where we're definitely not going to rely on China for things? That it's time to have those, very difficult, specific conversations that I don't think have really started to take place yet.
Yeah,
Fully agree. Very well said.
yes, that's a great point about identifying vulnerabilities and design appropriate response to deal with the China challenge. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts and insights with us today. I have a ton of other questions that unfortunately won't have time to go into today. We encourage all of our watchers and listeners to check out this detailed and timely report, which we'll link below. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff members working behind the scenes who have made today's interview possible. We hope that those who have tuned in today found the interview interesting and informative, and that you'll join us for future National Committee programming going forward. Thank you all again.